Most history books lie to you. They claim World War II was won by brilliant generals and tactical genius. But the truth is far colder. Hitler didn't lose because of a battlefield blunder, he lost because his tanks ran out of ball bearings. The real god of war wasn't a decorated marshal, it was a clerk with a ledger thousands of miles from the front. This is the story of how logistics, not generals, won the war. Logistics is the brutal mathematics of survival. It's the ability to turn raw iron in the ground into a loaded rifle in a soldier's hand on a different continent. While propaganda glorified invincible spirit, real victory was forged in shipyards launching ships every few days and factories building planes faster than they could be shot down. It was a war of trucks against horses, and standardization against chaos. Generals won battles, but logistics won the war. We will explore how American Liberty ships turned the Atlantic into a conveyor belt, how the USSR moved its entire industrial base behind the Urals under fire, and why the Wehrmacht was doomed the moment its supply line stretched too thin. You'll see why American canned meat was more vital to Stalin than new tanks. In 1941, the Axis powers had a terrifying head start. They had spent a decade militarizing their entire societies. But they made one fatal mistake, they underestimated the industrial sleeping giant across the Atlantic. While Hitler's factories were still using artisanal, small-batch production, the United States was about to apply the ruthless efficiency of the Ford Motor Company to the business of death. This was the birth of the arsenal of democracy, where victory was calculated in units per hour. The transformation was staggering. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, Henry Ford's engineers built an assembly line so vast it had its own weather system inside. By 1944, this single factory was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. While German technicians were hand-fitting parts for a few dozen wonder weapons, American workers, many of whom had never seen a cockpit before, were flooding the skies with thousands of standardized aircraft. This wasn't just manufacturing, it was a tidal wave of hardware that no amount of tactical genius could stop. This American miracle was built on three pillars: standardization, substitution, and scale. The U.S. stopped building civilian cars and started building Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels designed to be built so fast that they could be finished in under 5 days. These weren't the best ships in the world, but they were good enough and, more importantly, they were replaceable. The Allies realized that you don't win a global war with masterpieces, you win it with an endless supply of parts that always fit. By 1945, the U.S. was outproducing the entire Axis combined by a factor of 3. This industrial deluge meant that for every American tank destroyed, 2 more were already on a ship across the ocean. The war had moved from the realm of strategy to the realm of inventory management. The Axis was fighting a nation that treated war like a giant logistics puzzle, and they were about to be buried under the sheer weight of American steel. While American factories flooded the West, a silent river of supplies was flowing toward the Soviet Union. This was Lend-Lease, a logistical miracle that arguably saved the Eastern Front. Many historians focus on the T-34 tank, but the Soviet war machine actually ran on American fuel, ate American food, and moved on American wheels. Without the 400,000 Studebaker trucks provided by the U.S., the Red Army would have remained a horse-drawn force, unable to sustain the massive offensives that eventually broke the Wehrmacht. It wasn't just about weapons. The U.S. sent over 4 million tons of food, including the legendary Tashanka canned meat. This high-calorie fuel kept Soviet soldiers alive when their own agricultural heartlands were occupied or destroyed. Furthermore, America provided the high-octane aviation fuel and copper wiring that the USSR simply couldn't produce in sufficient quantities. While the Germans were struggling with a broken supply chain, the Soviets were receiving an entire industrial backbone via the dangerous Arctic convoys and the Iranian corridor. The statistics are staggering. Nearly a third of all Soviet explosives and over half of their aluminum came from the West. This allowed the USSR to focus its entire remaining industry on one thing: building tanks and guns. They didn't have to worry about building trucks or producing food because the arsenal of democracy was doing it for them. Logistics turned a starving, retreating army into a mobile, motorized juggernaut that could chase the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Lend-Lease proved that victory wasn't just about who had the best soldiers, it was about who had the most robust network. By bridging the gap between American factories and the Russian front, the Allies ensured that the German army was fighting not just a nation, but an integrated global economy. The Red Army provided the blood, but American logistics provided the veins. While the Allies moved toward total motorization, the German Wehrmacht was fighting a 19th-century war with 20th-century weapons. We often see footage of powerful Tiger tanks and sleek jets, but the reality of the German army was much bleaker. It relied on millions of horses. For every advanced Panther tank on the front, there were hundreds of horse-drawn wagons carrying food and fodder in the rear. This was a catastrophic mismatch. In a war of rapid movement, the speed of the German army was dictated by the stamina of a horse, not the horsepower of an engine. The second fatal flaw was over-engineering. While the Americans and Soviets prioritized good enough and mass-produced parts, the Germans built masterpieces. A Tiger tank was a terrifying weapon, but its parts were not standardized. If a Tiger broke down, it often needed a specific component that could only be hand-fitted by a master technician. In contrast, if a Soviet T-34 or an American Sherman broke apart, any mechanic could swap it out with a standardized replacement from a nearby crate. The Reich chose quality over quantity, forgetting that in a war of attrition, quantity has a quality of its own. By 1944, the German supply chain was a chaotic mess of hundreds of different vehicle types, each requiring unique spare parts and specialized tools. This logistical nightmare meant that a huge percentage of German armor was always out of action, waiting for a single bolt or a specific gear. As Allied bombers systematically dismantled the German railway system, the invincible Panzers became stationary pillboxes. They had the best guns in the world, but they had no fuel to move them and no parts to fix them. The German High Command ignored the golden rule: amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. They planned for short, decisive blitzkriegs and never built the industrial infrastructure for a long-term global conflict. While the Allies treated war like a factory floor, the Nazis treated it like a heroic saga. The result was inevitable: the German army didn't just lose the battle, it simply stopped functioning. The machine broke, and there was no one left to fix it. If the war in Europe was a battle of factories, the war in the Pacific was a battle of distance. The United States faced a logistical nightmare: how to project power across 10,000 miles of open ocean. Japan believed the sheer vastness of the Pacific would protect them, but they didn't count on the Seabees, the U.S. Navy construction battalions. These weren't just soldiers. They were combat engineers who could turn a barren coral atoll into a fully functional airbase with 6,000-foot runways in just 48 hours. The secret weapon of the Pacific wasn't the aircraft carrier, it was the floating supply base. The U.S. Navy developed service squadrons, entire mobile cities of tankers, ammunition ships, and floating dry docks. This allowed the fleet to stay at sea for months without returning to a permanent port. While Japanese ships had to limp back to Tokyo for repairs, American ships were fixed, refueled, and rearmed right in the middle of the ocean. This was logistical endurance on a scale never seen before, effectively shrinking the Pacific and allowing the Allies to hop from one island to the next. Contrast this with the Japanese strategy. Japan's military culture viewed logistics as menial work, unworthy of the samurai spirit. They focused on the decisive battle while ignoring their supply lines. As American submarines systematically sank Japanese merchant ships, thousands of Japanese soldiers were left to starve on isolated islands, cut off from food and medicine. They weren't defeated by bullets, they were defeated by interdiction. By 1945, the U.S. logistics machine was so efficient it could deliver fresh ice cream to sailors in the middle of a combat zone. To the Japanese, this was the ultimate psychological blow. It signaled that the Americans weren't just winning, they were so drowning in resources that they could afford luxuries while their enemies were eating grass to survive. The Pacific War proved that in modern conflict, the pier is as important as the perimeter. In the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union faced total annihilation. The Wehrmacht had obliterated their front lines and was racing toward their industrial heartlands. But while the world expected a collapse, the USSR executed the greatest industrial migration in history. In just a few months, they dismantled over 2,500 factories, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, and loaded them onto 1.5 million railway cars. This wasn't just an evacuation. It was a relocation of an entire civilization behind the Ural Mountains. The Soviet god of war wasn't just the Katyusha rocket, it was the steam locomotive. The Soviet railway troops performed the impossible, maintaining a constant flow of men and steel across thousands of miles of single-track lines. While the German supply system choked on the lack of standardized rail gauges and the endless Russian mud, the Soviet rail network became the iron spine of the Red Army. They moved entire cities of workers into the freezing wilderness, where factories began producing tanks in the open air, sometimes before the roofs were even built. But the real logistical masterstroke was simplicity. The Soviets realized they couldn't out-engineer the Germans, so they outproduced them with disposable design. A T-34 tank was designed to last only 6 months in combat. Why waste time on fine leather seats or complex optics when the tank would likely be destroyed in its first major engagement? By stripping away everything non-essential, Soviet logistics focused on a single metric: getting a functional gun to the front line as fast as possible. By 1943, the Red Army was outproducing Germany in tanks and planes by a massive margin, despite losing half its pre-war territory. The Germans were fighting a war of quality, but the Soviets were fighting a war of attrition and replacement. They understood that in the East, the winner wouldn't be the one with the most medals, but the one who could keep the trains running until the enemy's last horse collapsed in the snow. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the logistical revolution was just beginning. The Allies hadn't just won a war, they had perfected a system for moving anything, anywhere, at lightning speed. The methods born from the desperate need to crush the Axis became the blueprint for our modern global economy. The most direct descendant of World War II logistics is the shipping container. The struggle to unload Liberty ships proved that the real bottleneck of power was the port. This birthed intermodal transport, the idea that cargo should move seamlessly from ship to train to truck. Today, every product you own exists because of a supply chain that functions like the arsenal of democracy. From Amazon's next-day delivery to just-in-time manufacturing, we are living in the world the quartermasters built. Even our infrastructure is a military relic. The highway systems of America and Europe were designed for the rapid movement of tanks, yet they became the arteries of global commerce. Every advancement in mass-produced food and medicine was a logistical solution to a battlefield problem. The ultimate lesson of World War II is that power is not measured by the sharpness of a sword, but by the strength of a network. Generals took the medals, but the mechanics, drivers, and factory workers dictated the terms of surrender. They proved that in the modern age, the nation with the best ledger wins. History is written by the victors, but it is built by the logisticians. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel for more history without myths.